Now, before we get into this next lesson, I'm going to take a look at linear versus sRGB in textures. So first, I'm going to skip this mix node for the suit, just so we can remove that texture. So if you look at it up here, I'll pause it for a second. You can see it might look a little washed out, especially compared to this texture preview down here. So what we can try to do for this one and for the helmet diffuse is switch it from linear to sRGB. So you do that under color encoding here on the right. And you can see it got darker, and it looks like it may have gotten a little bit more contrasty. So now if we just select this body again, it looks like these color values are a little bit closer to this. And of course, the material and the lighting makes a difference too. So if we look at our material and go to environment, we are using a darker HDRI. So that's going to have some impact on how this renders. So if you ever have a physically based material that's looking a little washed out, just try going into the diffuse texture and switching that to sRGB. For your information channels though, like normal, I think these should probably always stick to linear. And maybe it depends how you export them, but just keep that in mind. And I think my head might look a little small, so I'm just going to tweak that really quick as well. All right, now on to the lesson. First, we're going to build a sort of environment that'll wrap around this whole scene. So we're going to put everything in the face tracker because we do want this scene locked to your face. So first, we're going to add a sphere as a sort of backdrop to catch the sky material we're going to use. So we're going to go to Add Asset, search AR library, and in 3D shapes here, we'll grab a high-res primitive sphere, import that, and then it appears here, and we'll just drag this in. And by default, it's just going to go in the focal distance, so we just need to drag this into the face tracker, because we want our whole scene to be locked in our face and not kind of floating. So with the sphere selected, let's increase the scale just by 10 for now, just so we can kind of see it while we're working on it. And to add a material, we have to go into the mesh and not the model. And we have this high-res sphere matte that came along with it, so we can just use that. We're going to change it from physically based to flat, because we want to ignore all the lighting information coming in the scene. And because this is going to be scaled really large, eventually we want to cull the front face. So that way we can only see the back face. So now if we just scale this to 100, eventually we'll probably make it a little bit bigger, but you can see no matter where you look, you can still see into the sphere, but you're always going to see this inside face once you're inside of it, or once your camera's inside of it. So this is just a handy way to build an environment that's going to always work, even if for some reason your camera gets outside of the sphere. So let's hop back into that material, and we can rename this to matte star background. And now I'm going to drag in a few textures that I have prepared for this. So we have some lasers, which I can share with you. And then I have a few nebula images, which I just downloaded from the internet, so I won't be able to share these or the rest of these actually, because I just got all these from Google. So you'll have to do your own searching and find these. So I'm just going to drag all these in, just so they're all prepped for us. And I've already compressed these, so I can turn off compression. And now checking our asset summary, we're sitting at 2.8 megabytes. So we're getting up there, but still under the 4 megabyte limit. So again, back in this star background material, under texture, we can grab space background, which is a more like nebulous one, or space seamless, which is more just little star points. But this texture isn't equirectangular, so we get pinching on the bottom. I believe the space background is, so there shouldn't be any pinching on the top or the bottom. So that's already looking pretty good for the environment. And now that we have it set, we can scale this even larger, just so we're not outside of it anymore. Might actually go really big, like 1,000. So now even when I'm as far zoomed out as Spark will let me, we're still inside of this environment. So now that we have this environment, let's add some actual 3D stars to this. So for this, we're going to use an emitter. So in the face tracker, just right click and add a particle system. And we're just going to move this forward in the Z. So just increase the Z value by a few. Maybe 3 is probably enough. And right now the particles are going up, so we want to change the spray angle. I'm just going to remove this randomness here. And I think in the Y, we want to change this to 90 degrees. So now it's going forward. And we'll change the type from point to ring and make this outer radius quite a bit larger. Maybe we'll start with 5. And for the inner radius, we could leave it at 0, but that means a star could potentially hit us in the face. So we might want to increase this a little bit, maybe 0.2, just so there's a little circle in here where there's not going to be particles emitted, so you'll have a little buffer around you. Maybe even 0.5, just to make sure it's far enough away. And to see what we're doing better, let's increase this birth rate to maybe 500. Okay, well now we can see the particles are going in the right direction, but the ring itself is still flat. So instead of changing the spray angle, let's change the rotation on the X. And it looks like negative 90 degrees will point it in the right direction. And because we want everything locked to our face, let's change this from world space to local. So now you can see when I look around, all of the particles move along with you. Now for the speed, I think all these should be maybe about the same speed. Let's try just 10% in the randomness. The lifespan needs to be quite a bit bigger. Let's do 30 seconds. And now that we have a longer lifespan, let's turn down the birth rate to something a little more manageable. And under warm-up, we do want to turn this on. And let's start with 30 seconds. So now if we restart this. Okay, well, maybe it's still a little thick, but you can see, I mean, they're little checkerboards right now, but you can kind of see where this is going. Now, actually, one thing I forgot is that if you do use this ring emitter, there's more concentration of particles near the center versus near the outside. So let's actually change this to a plane. And we need to make this 5 by 5 to roughly match what we had before. And now we need to rotate, I think, on the y-axis as well. Okay, I think I'm mixed up with all my rotations. So I'm going to set the speed to 0 just to troubleshoot this really quick. So the plane is set to 5 by 5, but it looks like it's just a line, which is a bit strange. Okay, switching it back and forth revealed that there's a 0.1 here. Well, this is strange. Let me undo all the rotations. Now we don't have any scale in here. And it's just inside the plane tracker, so there shouldn't be any additional scale. Now switching out and back in, there's a 0.1 right here. Sheesh. It looks like for some reason these values bugged out, but I think now we're back in action. So if we rotate this whole plane negative 90 degrees and add some speed back to this, using 0.2 again. Okay, now we have our star field. Now let's increase these values to 10 and 10, and the birth rate down to maybe 20. And then we can restart to see how that looks. All right, now that's starting to look pretty good. I think the speed can be higher. Let's try 0.5. So So now you can see we have this nice star field just moving along backwards in space. Literally in space. So with the emitter selected, let's rename it to stars. And then in the material, let's add a material here, create new, double click to rename, matte stars. Shader type will be flat. And for now, we're just going to keep it white. Later, we're going to add a little twinkling sprite sheet for these stars to make them a little bit more animated. Now in After Effects, we're going to make this little star twinkle. So we'll make a new composition. And we can set it to 64 by 64 and 1 second. So we just have 24 frames to work with. Now to make it a star shape, we can go up here to the shapes window and click on star. And double clicking in the star tool will actually fill the composition with the shape. It looks like it's maybe not totally filled, but close enough. Now we can scale this down and holding shift to make it square. And then under the contents down here, if we twirl this down and go to the path settings, we can change points from 5 to 4. That way it's more of a glint and not just like a star icon. Then the inner radius we can turn down a little bit. We want it to be just enough so we get a little bit of curvature right here. And make sure this is set to full. If you're at half, this is going to look really low res. So make sure this is full. And this is a little tiny. We're working with very few pixels, so let's just scale this up a bit. That way we have a little bit more softness there. And then over in Effects and Presets, you can search for glow and just use the default stylized glow. Now we'll add just a nice little bit of glow around this. And I'm hitting U here to minimize this. If you double tap U, you see all these settings that are kind of common settings or settings that have been adjusted. And then hitting U again will hide that. I think it could actually be a little bit larger, so I'll just scale this up again. And now that it's bigger, I think the middle could be a little bit smaller. So inner radius, I'll just turn down a little bit. And you'll notice because these pixels are right on this edge, they're kind of getting duplicated. So what I could do is scoot it down and over just a little bit. So now you can see we have a single pixel here, where before, if we scoot it back up, we were right between these two. So we were getting kind of a double pixel. So if we just match it where it's 1 pixel lower and 1 pixel to the side, it'll sharpen up that. And it won't be perfectly centered now, but I think it looks better to have these a little bit sharper. Now to make this twinkle, we can minimize this and then hitting Control, Option, or Alt and Y will make an adjustment layer. And from here we can add an exposure effect. Just drag that onto the adjustment layer. So now as we adjust the exposure, you can see this gets darker and brighter. I guess it's not going to get any brighter, but it can get darker, so we can twinkle that. The offset looks like it does a very similar effect, at least in this case. And gamma correction does nothing for this. So I think just working with exposure is good for us. So if we hold Alt or Option and click the little stopwatch next to exposure, we can add an expression down here. And all we want to use is the wiggle expression, which auto-completes here. And for the wiggle, I think if we find it in here, okay, there it is, under Property, Wiggle, you can see we have the frequency, the amplitude, octaves, amplitude multiplication, and time. So oftentimes you'll just use the first two values, so frequency and amplitude. So if we do like 5 and 1, it'll be repeating I don't know if that's 5 times a second or what, but let's just try. So we'll try 5, 1, and then just click out to accept that. So now I can see we're getting a little bit of twinkle. If we turn the frequency up from 5 to 20, it should go a lot faster, which I think is way too intense. I think 5 was pretty good. And for the amplitude, we could try 10, just see what that looks like. Obviously, that's really extreme. I think actually 1 or maybe 2 would be enough. Oh, it looks pretty nice. And if you want to make this a little more dynamic, you could wiggle the scale. So selecting the shape layer and hitting S will reveal this. And Alt Option clicking will reveal the little expression window. And we can just type wiggle 5, 1. See if that works for this too. Now you can see these values here as I scrub here. It's only changing by 1%. So this is going to have to be larger. Let's try 20%. So now you can see it's working, but it looks like the width and the height are independent. If I pause and scrub, you can see these two values ideally would be the same, but they're not. It looks like the wiggle is calculating for each of them independently. So it looks like this won't work, so let's delete that. And instead, let's try using a slider control. So in Effects and Presets, let's type slider control and drag that in. So this gives us a slider. So now we can hold the Alt Option and click this, and that'll bring up this little field again. So for this, we'll type wiggle 5, and then let's try 20, which would be 20%. And now if we scrub this, it looks like this is 70, 70, 80. So it looks like it's wiggling 20 values away from 71, which it was set to. If I type 50 here, it's now randomizing around the value of 50. So with that, I'll select the shape layer, hit S again, just bring the scale back. And now instead of using an expression here, we can use the pick whip and drag this onto this slider value here. So now both of these numbers should match this number exactly. So let's try. Obviously it's much smaller, so we can pause and change the slider from 50 to 100, or maybe even 150. Now let's play. So now you can see both of these values are identical because they're both pulling directly from the single value. So they're using the same wiggle for both. So now we have a nice little flickering star that is scaling and is changing brightness. So if you scroll away and zoom out, you can get a nice sense of what it'll look like in the scene. And we do have a lot of negative space still, so we could increase this a little bit more. Yeah, maybe 200 is a nice value to stick with. And we're going to pack this in a sprite sheet, so we don't want it to be too big. So with that, I'll hit Control M to bring up the render queue. And we want to set this from lossless to a PNG sequence. And then make sure RGB and alpha is checked. And then back here in your composition, turn back on this transparency just to make sure you do have alpha around here. Now I just need to set our output path. And then hit render. So once that's done, you should have a folder full of a few little sparkly stars. Now we're just going to open up Texture Packer and really quickly pack these together. So I'll just select all and drag into this window in the middle. And let's zoom in. It's a little hard to see, but we can select all and then go to Preview Anims. And then we'll turn off transparency and turn on black. And then we can just increase this frame rate. So here it is in action. It looks good. And we have the Spark AR Studio for Facebook preset made. So it knows to make a data file with this. So we just need to set this output path. And that will automatically fill in the texture file name. And everything else should be good since we have the preset chosen. And you can see all of these fit on there because none of them appeared out in this gray area, and there's no error down this corner. So with that, we can publish the sprite sheet. Now you can see our beautiful work right here. It's a very simple sprite sheet. And we could have definitely just used a grid instead of using the JSON file, but this will work just fine. So now as long as the JSON file is in the same folder, we should be able to just drag the sprite sheet and it'll grab this along with it. And I forgot to use Crushy to compress this, but it's a pretty small file anyway, so if you want, you can go and compress this, or you can just let Spark try and do its best job at compressing it. Looks like for Android it actually got bigger. But anyway, you can see up here the JSON is selected, so it knows how to use it. So now if we go to our stars material, and under texture, we need to grab our star twinkle. And it'll show all the individual ones here, but I think if we just choose this one, it'll actually use the correct one. So obviously it's using the entire sprite sheet. I think we actually need to add an animation sequence in here. So add that and call it anim star twinkle. And then in the texture, we can grab star twinkle. So now we'll use this instead of the entire sprite sheet. And the frame rate we can set probably pretty low to 12 because it's just twinkling. It doesn't have to be super smooth. So now in the material, instead of choosing the sprite sheet, we'll choose the animation. So there it is there. Now if we play, oh, it's going to be really hard to see. So let's increase the size of these stars temporarily. Currently they're at 0.01. Let's just try 0.1. Maybe even 0.5, just so we can really see. So now you can see them twinkling, and they're twinkling independently from each other. They're not all totally synced up, and that's because we're using a sprite sheet. So I believe as soon as they're emitted, each particle plays the sprite sheet on its own. So that lets these all twinkle independently. And we are getting some alpha clipping. So one way to reduce that is to go into the material, turn on alpha tests, and maybe just turn this up to 5%. We can also go to the advanced render options and turn off write to depth buffer. You can see as I toggle it on and off, it fixes that issue. But you want to keep use depth test on. That way, when an object is in front of it, they'll know to render behind it. You'll also notice that it looks like the particles are tilted. I'm actually going to turn down this alpha test now that we have the write to depth buffer turned off. So it looks like the stars are slanted, and that's because this tilt value is always set to default at 10%, which is annoying. So now if we restart, we have a beautiful shimmering star field. And if this is the style you're going for, you can keep them massive, but I'm going to make them a lot smaller again. Looks like 0.1 is nice because you can see the points of them a little bit. They will penetrate your suit if they go directly through, but that's fine. If you want to make sure that doesn't happen, you could have two individual particle emitters, one slightly on the left and one slightly on the right, and then just have a gap between the two planes. But I'll leave that up to you. So So now if we peel this out and just make this bigger, maybe they're a little big, but I kind of like them stylized like that. So I'll dock this. Now if you're noticing the background looks a little low res, it's because we are taking this 1K image and stretching it around a whole 360. So there is a trick we can do to kind of smush it together a little bit more. So if we go into the high-res sphere, which I should just name sky, and go to the material, under tile in the X, we can turn this from 1 to 2. And that basically squashes everything left and right, so it's kind of stretched up and down. But if we look around, you can see the edge of the universe is right here, and we do not want that. Well, maybe we do, but I don't know, maybe we don't. So if we go into the texture, if we scroll down to the tiling mode, you'll see U and V is clamped. So if we change this to repeat on both the U and the V just for safety, now we don't get any of that clamping. So now directly behind the user, it's higher res, it's a little squished. If we did want to repeat both in the X and the Y, we would have a little bit of a problem, because first let's look at this texture. So maybe it's hard to see right there, but if I open it here, you can see it's equirectangular. So on the very top, these pixels are really stretched out, and that's because of the way spheres are UV mapped. So the middle of the sphere is here, like the equator of the sphere is here, and the poles are on the top and bottom. So if we tile this in the U and the V, back in our material, you'll see we have a bit of an issue. So we have this ring down here and that ring up there. And it technically works, but now I just have darkness here. I guess we could adjust the offset. So if we type 0.5 here, looks like that actually works pretty well. But if you look right here, you see this is that stretched pixel. And if it was at the very top, now you can really see the issue. The UV coordinates of the sphere pinch everything at the top. And so if the texture is not built for that, you get some weird artifacts like that and probably at the bottom. So if you did want to tile the texture, you should actually use a seamless texture and not an equirectangular texture. So let's try using the space seamless. Now you can see it's acting weird because this also needs to be set to repeat under the tiling mode. So now we have that texture repeating. It actually matches the particle stars we have. And now with that set, we can actually go back into the material of the star background and tile this a few more times. And the nice thing about using a seamless texture like this is if we pull this out and zoom way in, you're not going to have any pixelation in this background because it's tiling a 1K image 5 or 6 times. So it's essentially using like a 5K image because we're tiling this. So if you want a higher res experience, make sure to find a seamless texture and then tile it. And it looks a little plain compared to the other background, but we're going to add some nebulas in here. So we'll fill it out a little bit more. Speaking of which, let's do that now. So in this face tracker, I'm going to right click, add a plane. And by default, it's right outside, so we need to make sure it's inside. And then I'm going to scale this pretty large because we're going to put it in the background. I need to pause so this doesn't keep flying around. It actually looks pretty cool with the stars in there a little bit larger. You can see all that parallax. So make this nice and big. Oop, not too big. And we'll move it back in space. And hitting F, you can focus on your object so that you can actually move around it better. And because this scene is so large, I actually can't zoom past this. Like the zoom out stops, so watch out for that when you're working on really big scenes. Now for this, we're going to make a material. Rename this matte nebula. This will also be a flat material. And I'm just going to grab one of these nebula images. And then for the blending mode, let's try add. So you see there's all sorts of issues. It looks like the stars might not even reach this far, so that doesn't matter, but it is blocking this background sky. So I think we might need to move the sky all the way back up, and then have the plane, and then the body, and then the stars, because I think the stars we want to render in front of the user pretty often. And I wish we could hide this 3D grid, but we can't, so we just have to kind of, I don't know, look at it through this viewport. So I'm going to select the body and hit F again to focus back out here. Here, let's just move this up to get off of the grid, just so we can see it a little better. And I'll turn on alpha test just to kind of clip it out a little bit more. Actually, there isn't any alpha. I think it's on black, so that didn't do anything, but that's fine. I'll rename this to Nebula 1. Control D to duplicate. And I'll move this over here. Rotate it. Maybe scale this up. And you can see these are not overlapping well because the order of these two. So if I just move this one above, that just automatically fixes that. And we can just spin this around so it looks like it's maybe just a continuation and not just a duplicate. Then I'll duplicate one more time, move this one more over in this corner, and I'll pull it forward. And for this one, I'm going to make a new material. So go down to create new material, rename it Matte Nebula 2, flat, and then I'll pick another nebula texture. And make sure add is set as well. And you can keep duplicating these as much as you want. Just make sure the order of these is correct. Or if you don't want to worry about that at all, you can just take the texture or the material and just turn off depth test and write to depth buffer for both of these. So now, no matter what order these are in, they'll all just render no matter what. But the order that the hierarchy is in is more important now, because if we take this and put it in front of everything, you'll see now it renders in front of the user, which looks cool, but is not what we want. So make sure it's between the sky and the rest of the scene. So now letting this play down for a second, I am noticing when the stars come into the frame, they're quite large, so I think I am actually going to do the 2 emitter idea. So I'll take the stars, duplicate that, and then we want this one to be just over here, and then the original to be on the opposite side. So now in theory we have this little window here where no particles should go. So we should avoid any stars going through your body. Now we have one more element to add to this sky or space environment. So this again will be a sphere. So let's just grab this high-res sphere again and drag it in. And this we want to place probably just after the nebulas. And we can scale this larger to maybe 50, 50, 50. And make sure you hit enter when you're typing in values. Sometimes if you don't hit enter, it might not commit that. Now this is going to be a planet, so it should also be pretty far away. So now it's not always going to be visible, but when you turn your head in the right direction, it'll show it behind you. So let's add a material. We have to select the mesh. And it does have a material, I think, but we've already changed that, so let's make a new one. This will be matte planet. And for this, I think we do want to use a physically based, because we'll use an HDRI to light it. Then under texture, I have a planet texture that I've purchased, so I can't share that with you, but I'm just going to use it here. And if you just go online and search equirectangular planet texture, or probably just even planet texture, you should be able to find some free ones on Google. Just make sure you get the permissions to use it if you use it on a client project. Here's what I'll be using. And again, you can see the top and the bottom are stretched because of the UV mapping. So then under environment, I'll turn that on and then enable the night. Now you can see we get this super shiny planet. And it looks like there's one nebula after it, so we want to make sure that's above it. And while this looks neat, obviously we don't have shiny planets. So in the material, we'll turn up the roughness. You don't want to turn it too high necessarily. You want some of those highlights to show through, just so you get a little bit of lightness on the sides. And it does feel a bit bright, so I'm going to go change this from linear to sRGB, just to darken those. And right now we're actually not using any lights in the scene. We're only using physically based materials to get reflections and stuff. So there's not going to be a really hard light on one side and a shadow on the other, which maybe would be ideal. Instead, if you just want to darken it, you can always hop into the color channel and just turn this down, just so it's not so illuminated. So now we have a nice little planet back there. I'll rename this to planet. And why don't we just duplicate this? And then we can just move this over, scale it down. And because it's just kind of a brownish gray color, I don't think you'll really be able to recognize that these are the same. So I just scaled it, rotated it, and repositioned. So now I have two little planets back there. Maybe this one can be deeper in space. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. All right, so we have a lot going on in this scene now, but it's looking really cool. And up next, we're going to use some audio cues to emit some lasers, because we can't have enough lasers in this course.